Win after win, championship after championship. The R32 GTR is a performance weapon so good it wins the JGTC 4 years in a row. First place in every single race it enters, all 29 of them. Even the Australians have rage quit after it dominated their Grand Touring Championship, so sick of seeing taillights that they banned turbocharging and all-wheel drive altogether, the corporate version of throwing your controller at the screen because you're losing. Nicknamed Godzilla, Nissan had built a car that set soaring standards for its successors, and the R32's reign had to come to an end. Nissan would need to create something beyond insane to exceed the R32's performance and handling, but contrary to popular belief, Nissan succeeded in doing so. The R33 GTR, successor to the R32, was nothing short of an engineering marvel. Let's take a look at how Nissan took the perfect recipe that made the R32 and turned it up to 11, but most of us just didn't see it. The much-loved R32 was released in 1989, weighing 1,430 kilos, which doesn't sound like much by modern standards, given that the new BMW M2 is more than 1,700 kilos, but this was a fairly substantial amount of weight in the late 80s. It is in fact more than 100 kilos heavier than a Volvo 245. The R32 was definitely not known as a lightweight performance car, mainly due to its complex Atessa all-wheel drive system. As a result of this, when the R33 was released and it had put on another 100 kilos, fans were skeptical. The car had gotten longer, rounder and substantially fatter. On paper, it had to be slower, but the R33 was a whole 23 seconds faster around the Nürburgring than the previous R32. How could this be possible, given the extra weight? Not only this, but the car had exactly the same advertised 276 horsepower as the previous car, with a big emphasis on the word advertised. Japan had recently introduced the Gentleman's Agreement. This was an agreement formed by automakers in the late 80s. They agreed that their performance cars would not exceed 276 horsepower. This was an attempt to deter street racing and make the roads safer. It was never legally enforced, but instead mutually agreed, and served as a friendly reminder that if automakers got into horsepower battles, the cars could get far too fast and far too dangerous for the tiny Japanese roads. Both the R32 and the R33 were subject to this agreement, but in reality, the practice wasn't taken very seriously, and manufacturers proceeded to get into horsepower battles regardless. But at least they stuck to the most important part, which was blatant false advertising for safety and stuff. Advertisement was always strict. Official horsepower ratings for all of the iconic performance cars coming out of Japan were always limited to this 276 figure. But if you put the cars on a dyno, they usually produced more. We let them get away with this because who buys a car then complains it's got more power than they thought? In reality, the R32 produces around 280 horsepower to the wheels, which is more like 320 to the crankshaft. Crank horsepower is the number the manufacturer usually advertises. The R33 is rumoured to make slightly more than this, which is likely true given that Nissan engineers turned up the boost in the R33 and went from an 8-bit to a 16-bit ECU for more in-depth engine tuning. This is a good representation of how loosely followed the Gentleman's Agreement really was. The R32 made an advertised and very convenient 276 horsepower. So what do you think happens if in the R33 you take exactly the same engine but you turn the boost up? 276 horsepower of course, but that 23 seconds around the ring had to come from more than just a little extra boost. The R33's drivetrain and chassis underwent some substantial improvement over the R32. On the standard version of the car, the differentials were essentially the same from a hardware perspective, but the R33 had some tweaks made to the software controlling the differentials to help eliminate understeer. The standard R33s also got bigger Brembo brakes, previously only available on the V-spec version of the R32. Huge improvements were made to the rigidity and weight distribution too, all in the fight against the understeer the R32 was known for. Nissan made a substantial number of changes which resulted in a chassis 150% more rigid than the R32. The R32 also had an issue with the rear end becoming light as it began to run low on fuel. This problem was eliminated in the R33 by relocating the fuel tank. Many were upset that the R33 had a longer wheelbase, giving it more of a GT car look and making the car appear as if it had strayed from its driver-focused sports car roots. But most didn't know that this longer wheelbase is what allowed Nissan to relocate the fuel tank and improve the handling. The R33 also had some major improvements made to its aero, improving both straight line and cornering performance. All of these changes resulted in a car so much better that Nissan's main test driver, Hiroyoshi Kato, said that the R33's performance completely surpasses the R32's. Of course, Nissan's test driver would always say this, but the lap times and performance speak for themselves, and the R33 went on to become the benchmark for the R34. Another argument made against the R33 is the way it looks. Personally, I love the way all of the GTR variants look equally. The R33 doesn't stand out to me as the ugly one, but that's entirely subjective and up for you to decide. To fully understand where the R33 stands in the GTR lineup, we need to take a look at how its younger siblings were received. It would be misrepresentative of me to say that the R33 is hated, that's just untrue, but it's generally regarded as the one that gets the least appreciation of the bunch, and it did receive some criticism upon release. The GTR range stars some of the most iconic and treasured cars ever built. The R34 did the impossible, and arguably outgrew the R32's legendary status, not so much within motorsports, but as a road car. With the help of booming tuning culture in the early 2000s, the R34 was an instant hit, and a perfect blank canvas for modification. But if modification wasn't your thing, it was an extremely capable car out of the box. The R35 also followed a similar path. They cemented themselves as automotive legends within motorsport and on the road. But the R33 was, and still is, deemed to be the one not to have. It had huge boots to fill following the R32's immeasurable success. But if the R34 and the R35 managed it, why didn't the R33? When looking at both cars, it's easy to see why on paper, the R33 may have seemed somewhat disappointing. It had huge boots to fill, and its improvements weren't as obvious as they were subtle handling modifications, one of which made the car appear bigger and more cumbersome, and the gentleman's agreement meant that it seemed as if the car had simply gotten heavier and not moved forward. But diving deeper into the development, it's clear to see that the R33 did make substantial progress forwards. The R34 didn't have quite so much weight on its shoulders, and after a cold reception to the R33, it had a much easier job. Perhaps the R33 is a case of slightly poor marketing, unfortunate circumstances, and the car being overshadowed by its older brother, which soaked up all the victories before new regulations made it obsolete in many motorsport classes. Most who have driven an R33 agree that they are in fact brilliant cars, and in reality, a fair bit faster. Faster doesn't always mean better, but when the R33 was such a similar car, but with improved handling and power, it's hard to argue that the R33 didn't at least deserve a little more credit considering the amount of credit its little brother received.